Zero Hour. I'm your host, Richard RJ Eskow. I'm very pleased to be once again speaking with my friend and friend of the program, Professor Richard Wolff. Richard Wolff is the host of Economic Update on Free Speech TV. He is an economist, an economics professor, and an economic historian. He is also professor emeritus at the University of Massachusetts Amherst and a visiting professor at New York University. If I recall correctly, his latest book is The Sickness is the System, about the COVID epidemic. And first of all, Richard Wolff, welcome back to the program.
Thank you, RJ. Glad to be back.
Glad to have you back. So what I had, I think I sent this article to you for a discussion with a note along the lines of, this pissed me off, or some erudite economic insight like that. But it was an article in the New York Times entitled, "Poor Countries Need Climate Funding. These plans could unlock trillions." The subheading is "Global Warming Delivers Cascading Weather Disasters. Leaders at UN climate talks say it's time to radically overhaul the World Bank and International Monetary Fund," for which many years ago I would consult from time to time. Now, it seems to me, first of all, don't get me started on the word unlock. Unlocking money is always such a strange phrase. But the gist, this is from the COP27 Climate Summit in Egypt. It seems to me that, first of all, you followed the proposal at hand. I took it to be, first of all, whenever I hear the phrase financial innovation, I immediately reach for my watch and wallet on behalf of the global working class. But secondly, it seems to me the great insight is here will make it easier for poor countries to borrow to offset the damage that has been done to them by the wealthy countries that will lend them money at a profit to themselves, perhaps less than before, but profit to themselves. And this is an enlightened way to govern the world and address climate change. Am I being unfair to these innovative thinkers?
No, you're being generous. I think it's time to take off the delicate gloves and, as they say, tell it like it is. Let me use a parallel to get into it. The Biden administration has its spokesmen and women out there explaining how much they got done, the enormous amounts of money that they allocated in 4 or 5 bills over the last year or two. Okay, the minute you look beyond the public relations gloss, here's what that amounts to. Under the heading of infrastructure or combating inflation or recovery, carefully avoiding to state what it is the recovery of a system that crashed, put that all aside. What it amounts to is vast amounts of money given to a relatively small number of very large corporations. The people who can build a canal or repair the bridges or whatever infrastructure comes to mean. And those companies will do with that government spending what they have always done with both public and private spending on them. They will give the minimum they have to the workers who do the work, and give the maximum salaries to their top executives, the maximum dividends to their major and other shareholders. In other words, these huge corporations will process the government spending in precisely the ways that have got us to the bad situation our economy is in. They will use, just to make it crystal clear, they will use the money the government is giving them, among other things, to hire more lawyers and accountants to evade taxes. They will use that money because they're free to, by the way. There's nothing illegal. I'm describing what they are entitled by the laws as they stand to do. They can spend a lot of that money completing their movement of jobs and industry out of the United States to other parts of the world where it's more profitable to do the business. It on and on. We're not going to change anything about the basic problems of our economy if we keep having the government throw huge amounts of money at the very institutions, modern capitalist enterprise, that have produced the very problems we're facing. And to finish the example, it's because those big corporations have been so successful in evading taxes by changing the tax laws, by creating tax-exempt institutions both here and abroad, by escaping to jurisdictions around the world where they don't have to pay taxes, and I could go on. It's precisely their behavior that starved the government of the money with which it might have maintained our infrastructure. So now we are paying them extra big bucks to fix the infrastructure when we know from history that they are the key institution that brings us to the absurd dilemma of paying them to fix what their behavior brought low in the first place. It kind of, once you see it, it should take your breath away. And now,
so the antidote is the poison. In other words, that's the antidote they're trying to administer.
That's right. They're going to make the problem, and then they scratch their heads and ask themselves why, since every half-wit knows that if you don't maintain the infrastructure of an economy, it's going to crumble. It's going to show up in higher costs to move freight across a broken bridge or an inadequately maintained highway. I mean, this is not advanced rocket science, not even close. So you'd have to explain why otherwise intelligent people would allow the infrastructure to be as dilapidated in the United States as the Army Corps of Engineers and many others have demonstrated over and over again it is for decades. This is not some mystery that's because the government didn't have the money and would not dare tax the people who have the money to do this thing. It's short-sighted among the big corporations, but they're confident, and unfortunately, rightly so, that if they let it deteriorate beyond a certain amount, there'll be a groundswell of opinion carefully nurtured by the Democratic Party to get the taxpayer in general to foot the bill so that those who make the profit will not have to pay for the dilapidation of the infrastructure. Look, the IMF and the World Bank are exactly analogous. They were the champions for the last 40 years of quote unquote globalization, or if you like, a new world order of free trade and unfettered capital movements. That's the language they use. That's the BS they forever publish and republish. And they now want us, the average people, to come up again with the taxes, give them the money so that they, in their wisdom, can do something about the damage to the climate that 40 years of their policies and their money are largely responsible for. They were asked to have an ecological consciousness 5, 10, 15, 20, 25 years ago. It came to nothing. And there, again, is no mystery here unless you need ideologically to wear blinders. Those institutions serve capitalism. That they admit. Capitalism is a system that prioritizes the maximization of profit. What the World Bank and what the IMF do is everything they can think of to maximize private capitalist profit. Their priority never was and is not now and shows no sign to me of becoming something other than profit maximization, something other than cheerleading and facilitating capitalism. It's true, it's harder to do that now because the neat arrangement of Washington at the top, having its own powerful government to shape the world with the assistance of quote unquote international organizations in which the United States prevails and dominates and always has, like the IMF, like the World Bank, and countless others. We're supposed to believe, given their performance, that we should entrust the damage being done and the suffering in the emergent economies from a global pollution they could not afford to contribute to. Again, you have to be a mixture of complicit and culpable and blind to take another headline like this seriously. And shame on the New York Times for being yet again a mouthpiece for these fatuous declarations without even the ability to get a columnist, and they have them, to raise at least a question about all this chicanery rather than pretending once again.
So, I look at this, and thank you for all that. I look at this and I see, okay, climate change, we are disproportionately responsible for here in the United States, certainly on a per capita basis, but overall as well. We, not these developing countries, are responsible for the problem. Climate change, its consequences include desertification that affects developing countries, floods that devastate developing countries, food shortages that devastate developing countries. And so the US-led response of the developed countries who created this mess is, we'll give you a special rate to borrow from us to try to keep alive in the wake of what we've done to you. That to me, in a nutshell, is the injustice. And I guess part of what I struggle with about it is, one can imagine within a country, one can imagine revolution or political change of some kind that rights these wrongs begins to right these wrongs. But when you're talking about developing countries versus the US or Western Europe, it feels tough. Like in getting justice for, first of all, step one is what we're talking about now, right? Pointing out that how grotesquely unjust the whole concept is. But then it gets into, don't we need new multinational institutions and a new, people say they're pro or anti-globalization, a new kind of globalism that is not based on wealth production for the few. But it seems to me that's where we've got a challenge in front of us, don't you think?
Yes, but let me open a different way of thinking about that. For the last 40, 50 years, your description is exactly right. Very difficult for Nigeria or Paraguay or Malaysia to break out of the fact that they have to pay in environmental destruction and the costs of it for the rampant industrialization from which they were excluded by the polluters. For the last 50 years, this horror was reenacted every year. And you were right. Any government that tried, if it was revolutionary, if it wanted genuinely to take care of its people, would face insuperable obstacles because of the opposition of the United States to anything that interfered not only with the profitability of American companies, but with the hegemony operated by the United States through institutions like the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund. But now that situation has changed. And I'm going to spell out the change, and I think it'll throw a lot of light on what's happening around the world because it's governed by that change. For the first time in the last 75 or more years, there is another place for countries that want to change to turn to. For the first time in 75 years, the United States has a serious economic competitor. It didn't have that in the memory of everybody living today. We have been living in a one-country-dominated world economic system. Let me drive it home because, I'm an economist, so I'm supposed to have numbers at the tip of my tongue. So let me throw one at you, right? The most recent GDP of Russia, ostensibly a great power that we're struggling with in Ukraine, et cetera, right? The GDP of Russia in the most recent year, about $1.5 trillion. GDP is a rough measure of the total output of goods and services an economy can produce in one calendar year. What's the most recent GDP of the United States? Well, around $21-22 trillion. Okay? That's a relationship which the Bible would depict as David and Goliath, with the unfortunate clarity you all have as to which country is playing which role in this game. They have never been, when they were the Soviet Union or now, they've never been an economic competitor. They've never been able to turn to the Soviet Union in some general way or to post-Soviet Russia as an alternative. You had a few isolated, desperate cases. Cuba is the most famous. But look where Cuba is, what it has suffered. 50-year embargo, lunatic kind of policy, only makes the matters worse, etc. But it doesn't solve the problem. When the Soviet Union disappeared, Cuba's back in a way to square one. But all of that has changed. Across Latin America, across Asia, and across Africa, I could take a long time that we don't have to rattle off the number of governments that are changing their orientation. They are playing the United States and to some degree Western Europe off against China, now assisted by India and Russia and Iran and Turkey, and I could go on. There's a whole new world out there, and that's why the United States is declaring China its great enemy. What China does, and I'm not endorsing the Chinese system or the Chinese government, Lord knows they have their problems, their failures, etc. I'm not talking about that. I'm not advocating. I'm trying to explain that the world is different and the United States is turning against China because China is challenging everything that has happened in the last 50 years. And so far, and we've had a good 10, 15 years basically of this change now, the effort of the United States to stop it, failure, which is freaking the people in Washington out, which I can see, and I hope others of you can see as well. The war in Ukraine is not independent of all of this. It's more about the U.S. versus China than it has anything to do with Russia, and even less to do with the sad people of Ukraine who are going through this horror. But it is the reality. And that is the same problem that has made the progress around ecologically undoing the damage of 3 centuries of capitalism so difficult. If you don't confront this system, and if you don't offer alternatives, then you're going to build up a pressure that will explode. And the only thing that might derail it may in the end be worse for the United States, which is the demise of the U.S. empire and the arrival of the Chinese. And what will that then mean? And what will those situations? And since we are all these days nuclear powers, the idea that you're going to fix it by military is beyond stupid.
But, that's interesting because that was going to be my next question. First, I have just an observation, which is, the total size of the Russian economy which you just gave us, is therefore between a half and a third of what we spend on healthcare alone in the United States. I think the last figure was $4.1 trillion annually, for which we get falling life expectancy and the worst health outcomes among all developed nations. So, the health economy is a wealth transfer system for the United States, which itself is 2.5 to 3 times larger than the entire Russian economy, which I had never thought about before. So that was interesting to me. But in terms of the military, a lot of us have been scratching our heads, wondering why the U.S. is being so bellicose towards China in the last, they may have added more money to it since then, since they keep upping it. But the last Pentagon budget included, I think, $3.9 billion for military exercises in the South China Sea. And I think if China was spending $3.9 billion to have military exercises off the coast of California, we'd be upset about it. But, so a lot of us are looking at that and saying, why? But, I've begun to wonder recently, and it's very germane, I think, to what you've been saying. I've begun to wonder whether they're not hoping to replicate what they believe they did to bring down the Soviet Union, which is to drive it bankrupt by forcing it to spend so much on the military that it couldn't sustain. But if so, it seems to me as a very inapt comparison based on what you're saying. But does that at all make sense to you? Or is it just reflexive that we see this economic empire rising and threatening us, so the only thing we know how to do is, or the main thing we know how to do besides sanctions and so on, is military chest beating? I mean, how does that fit into all of this?
Well, my interpretation is similar to yours, a little bit different. I would argue that they believe their strategy worked with Russia. And if you're 20 times or whatever it is, if it's David and Goliath, if it's an enormous economy that rules the world on one hand, and a small, desperate economy on the other, then a strategy of exhausting them with an arms race, which you can afford much more readily than they can, makes a certain sense. And they probably believe that this actually was the clue. I would argue that there were many other things going on, but I think there's a point to the usage of the arms race for that kind of competition. They were frightened by the Soviet Union because it was the biggest threat to their domination at that time, even though the threat was mostly military and barely that, never very powerful politically and even less powerful economically. But let me give you the GDP of China in the most recent year. It's around 17, 18 trillion. So you can see way larger than Russia and catching up with the United States, because for the last 25 years, the Chinese economic growth of its GDP has averaged 2 to 3 times the rate of growth of the United States, which is why not only is this a competitor, and has been, but it's a competitor who's winning and continues in the pandemic, out of the pandemic. It doesn't stop this 2 to 3 to 1 ratio of economic growth, which is why most international economists, left, right, and center, predict that China will have the larger of the two economies by the end of this decade of the 2020s. These are fundamental shifts, historic, epoch-making, and they, I believe, are at the center of all of this. And those of us, whatever our particular struggles are, whether it be ecological or for economic democracy or whatever the objective, I think we're going to have to more and more think through and practically connect to the reordering of the world economy, because that's going to determine how successful we are as much or more than almost anything else that's going on. And if we can have direct effect over that, All right, but at the very least, our strategies about what we do, where we are, have to be informed by what is happening out there. Russia learned from what happened in the arms race when they couldn't afford to keep up, and they went through an internal trauma that brought Mr. Putin to power and so on. They learned the same lesson that other small countries have, which is as long as we're small and as long as we're isolated, we will be easy to pick off one by one. The trick is to build real alliances amongst those of us, and that's what we have. Russia, China, India, BRICS, these are all steps in a process in which the people who learned have adjusted their strategy. And so you might be seeing a whole new combinatory or combining strategy on the one hand, while the United States continues to rattle the saber, imagining that it'll do again what it did last time, and that the people who suffered last time learned nothing from what they went through. That's a mistake, and a big one.
An aside and then a question, if I may. The aside is this. I was sick recently, and I watched several big budget Chinese science fiction movies. And I say this for a reason, which is at least two of them. It was fascinating for me because I loved science fiction movies as a kid. And they depicted the Chinese nation and the military and the scientists. They were the heroes of the world-saving story, and repelling the aliens or saving the Earth from going off orbit or whatever. And, without even second-guessing, it seemed. It was just like in these movies, the future was Chinese. And I just had the passing thought, this is what American movies looked like 50 years ago, 60 years ago. And don't anymore, by the way, a lot of the time. And I just wondered, is this what it felt like to be English and watching an American movie in the 1950s or late 1940s? Is this what it feels like to be part of an imperial power who's reluctantly is going to yield to another? I mean, I guess as a hypothetical question, but before I get to my others, I just wanted to mention that to you. I don't know if you have any thoughts about that, but
I do, because exactly the same logic and reasoning has been happening to me, but also to more and more of the people I talk with. And, because I'm a product of the American elite school system, to a number of the friends I have from college and university days who don't agree with me politically, who are happy with capitalism. So I'm struck that they, like you and me, are very much in the groove of saying it must have been very difficult to be the British Empire, which lost 2 wars trying to hold on to the United States, trying to force it to stay a colony when the capitalists here had enough. Didn't care that they were of British background, didn't care that they had sworn to support King George III. They were ready to go to war, to fight against the British, to kill British soldiers, which they did twice in the 1775-67, around then, and then again in the War of 1812, having to show the British, it's over. You're not in charge anymore. And those of us that want to break away, we will do it either the way we have, or you can, if you want, change the name of colony, call it a commonwealth. You can call it a yellow bean pie. It doesn't matter. Your days are done. And then the rest of the 19th century is the steady rise, by the way, not only of the United States as a competitor to the British Empire, but the Germans were trying to do exactly the same thing. And a little bit later, the British trying to do this. I'm sorry, the Japanese.
Oh, the Japanese, of course. Yes,
Japanese. Yeah. And there were still the other empires, French, Russian, and so on. But the British faced a long-term decline of their empire and the rise of another one. And if you follow British literature, you'll see exactly what you're just surmising. Changing movies, changing novels, changing imagery, changing attitude towards the United States, from being arrogant and an upstart and frontier people with no couth, with no
Right.
polish, with no, all of that had to be changed until the 20th century, when the standard international joke is that when the United States tells the British to jump, the British response is always, how high is the question?
Right.
Not literally a pain that's doubly painful because it's role reversal, right? The Chinese are different. They never were a colony. They came close to being a colony. They had portions of their territory taken over, but China as a whole is unusual among so-called third world countries because it always held on to an old unified civilization. And that's giving them a lot of support as they imagine, as you point out, that the future is Chinese. That for them is an attractive proposition. That in Washington is a nightmare.
And obviously we're coming to the end, but, and I think about, first of all, Britain responded to this by electing and initiating at least 20 years of a reasonably socialist government, right, making massive changes on that front. But then you think about the post-war culture, literature, theater, and Look Back in Anger, and Room at the Top, and then in the 70s where it was more American expansion, punk, and No Future for You. And I just hope we plan for this shift. I mean, that's one of my ideals, and one of the reasons why I appreciate our conversation, a chance to plan for this shift and do it in a humane way. And then in terms of this issue of a global alliance, Nehru tried it, obviously, with his non-aligned nations. And I know some people are trying, Yanis Varoufakis and others, to create a progressive international. I don't think it's really taken off, but I think if we keep these things in mind, I think, planning for a humane transition at home and an alliance abroad is not a bad way to go, but I'll give you the last word.
Yeah, no, I use the example of the British, and I say, a little bit exaggerated, but I say, after losing 2 wars, the British realized that militarily, even though they were a much grander military force, they had the global navy, the United States had nothing comparable, and no prospect of doing it soon. They lost twice, they lost badly, and they had to come up with another way. And so they entered into, they toyed during the American Civil War with siding with the South. True, they were bitter from what they had lost, but in the end, they made the rational decision that they were better off trying to make it work peacefully than having a series of wars, which they looked like they could never win. And my hope is that the United States and the Chinese, one or both of them, in the end, it'll have to be both, make a roughly comparable kind of decision so that they give the rest of us a chance to have a life rather than see everything disappear. That's why the war in Ukraine, I believe, is very important, not for itself, but for what it says about the historical moment we all find ourselves in.
Well, on that note, unfortunately, we're going to have to end. But as always, Richard Wolff, economist, historian, host of Economic Update, always a great pleasure speaking with you. And as always, thanks so much for coming on the program.
And it's always a pleasure here, too. You have a wonderful way of bringing the most important dimensions of these issues up to the foreground of our conversation. It's sort of, for me, the opposite of the many other interviews I do on mainstream, more mainstream media, where it almost seems to me they do the opposite, to find the least important dimension of these topics to talk about and literally miss the forest for the trees they detail and focus us on.
Well, thank you. And I look forward to the next time.
As do I.
Thank you. We'll be right back after this. I'm Richard RJ Eskow, and this is the Zero Hour.